everyone, welcome to another Animation Friday, and today I am going to be briefly looking into something that I think is significantly important when it comes to animation as a medium, and that's its impact on nostalgia and the whole concept of nostalgia. And I'll kind of dive into sort of my thoughts on this. And I apologize again that this is being uploaded late. I mentioned yesterday that I wasn't going to be able to upload till Monday. Luckily, I am able to be caught up by the end of today on Sunday as opposed to Monday, so that's good. So basically, when it comes to animation's impact on nostalgia, I think it is a huge driving force because largely upon animation's foundation, it was primarily geared towards children. And when you are using that as your primary market, it really does allow you to um, really keep that market sort of going because, oftentimes you'll see parents sort of introducing their children to various animations that they've grown up with throughout the years, whether that be through television or as well as film, um, and or being obviously that they could um, show their kids various different uh, mediums in which animation is used, in particular within television and movies. But um, I think what nostalgia has brought to animation is a lot of good as well as I think sometimes negative elements. And for example, there's ways in which, in particular, animators use nostalgia to a good effect, to where it's ultimately producing something that is reflective onto maybe um, now adults' childhood, but something that they can again pass on towards their children or back to. This is something that Toy Story in particular did really well of, because or at least did well in doing, because it came out at a time when there was a certain demographic of kids that watched it as children. And you'll see that once Toy Story 3 came out, you'll see those same kids kind of growing up, and at least that grew up with Toy Story, going and visiting the film again. And hence they know the characters, hence they know the concept, hence they know what's ultimately going on. And I think, again, that's an example of a positive nostalgic marketing sort of effect. You build up this generation of kids that have grown up with what you've presented to them, and you carry that on over throughout generations. And that's, I think, in particular what Toy Story actually did fairly well of when Pixar initially released those films, and the times that they released them, at least. However, in other respects, it doesn't really lend itself well. Like, for example, Alvin and the Chipmunks. Talk about something that initially got started with, I believe, within the 60s, if I'm not mistaken, and then was transferred over into film, because I think originally the Chipmunks were supposed to be sort of part of television. And again, I think they did get some brief exposure, at least I think within the 90s, maybe 80s. I'm not entirely sure exactly when those 2D cartoons came out. In particular, I think even some films that came out that revolved around the Chipmunks. And then later on, within the 2000s, we have the Chipmunk movies carried over into the 2000 teens or 2010s, and again, it's transferring something that is somewhat, you could consider nostalgic to those children that are technically grandparents or maybe parents onto their basically other generation. So the kids that grew up with Chipmunks in the 1960s, for example, would, um, you know, transfer that knowledge sort of onto um, kids that are growing up at least around this time now. Um, and oftentimes I feel like when you're trying to bring up something that is somewhat nostalgic within animation, you almost have to provide a very good transition. And this is just an example of a sort of bad transition because up, even initially upon the Chipmunks and their popularity, it was largely derived through a song. Um, it wasn't necessarily something that was really thought up as creatively as some other um, cartoons that at least were coming around during that time. And so it was one of those things where it didn't transfer, I think, all too well nostalgically. And primarily that's a result of, obviously them not putting in any effort into it and just slapping the Alvin and Chipmunks name on it and claiming that it's somehow good. So again, that's I think an example of a bad transfer of generations as far as a cartoon is concerned and creating some kind of nostalgia behind it, since it did initially come out within at least I believe the 60s or 50s. And also, there's actually one that is primarily going on right now and is sort of really in the works. I believe that it initially came out last weekend, but that's the Peanuts movie. Because again, we've had the 1960s where the Peanuts were fairly popular, and then they're trying to transfer that same nostalgic effect onto the children of this generation. And I think they did it, at least from what I could tell by the previews. I haven't seen the film actually, but primarily what they try to do, I think, is rather clever because they do insert a more computerized version of it so that it appeals to the children of today, but it's all designed primarily to be the characters that maybe even grandparents to a certain extent knew and loved when the Peanuts initially came out, at least within the 60s. And I think that's, for the most part, from what I can tell, a smart transfer of nostalgia, as far as, passing it on to the next or other generation. But again, we obviously see, I think, negative as well as positive ends on this because obviously there can be some nostalgia taken and sort of inserted as part of today. Like, for example, Tangled is a good example because it transfers the sort of Disney-esque formula that sort of existed within the 90s and way back within the 50s and largely 50s, I would say, and to maybe a certain extent the 40s, and in doing so, transferring that onto something that the current generation can enjoy. And again, that was primarily the switch between 2D and 3D, since Tangled was 3D. So again, I think the transfer over onto the next generation has, I think, really worked out well for animation as a medium because it really allows you to see something that was initially created maybe way back when, but in a completely different light. And although some people might say that the nostalgic effect that certain animation has onto one generation might be, it might give the impression to people that, oh, Hollywood is lazy. They're just taking something that existed before and they're just moving it on over to this generation. But I think it's just the way in which you transfer that that nostalgic effect. Sometimes it can be, I think, overall effective and really give you a new way of looking at something. And other times it just gives off, again, a negative effect, similar to, I think, primarily when you're looking at something like Alvin and the Chipmunks, When you look at the Smurfs, for example, that's another good example of not transferring, I think, nostalgia ultimately all too well. And again, it really just shows by all of the things that a lot of film really does try to do, which is provide the story, the characters, um, and give you a sense of what the whole premise behind the animation was. So that's at least the original animation that was created way back whenever. So that's really, I think, something that's important to understand because it is a brilliant marketing strategy because you're taking something that was initially there and you're carrying it on over um, to a newer generation. And in doing so, you're bringing over that nostalgic effect that was primarily part of when the cartoon was created, whether it be a television show, whether it be a movie. And sometimes, I mean, Peanuts was primarily television, and now they're trying to take it and put it into a film. And I think that's also interesting because sometimes you'll see these mediums kind of transferring over. Again, Chipmunks sort of similar to, they'll transfer and make a movie out of something that maybe was a TV show, or, um, they'll again maybe even use a different medium sometimes, depending. For example, Batman probably has been utilized in a variety of different mediums over the years. In particular, a lot of different superhero films, like when you look at Spider-Man, that was initially just a cheesy cartoon, and then later on it's made into these full-length feature films. So again, it's really an interesting effect, and primarily a lot of it is driven by animation and is driven by um, using that medium as a means of creating some kind of effect onto people, in particular younger generations. And in doing so, it impacts them later on in life, and they want to kind of introduce those things to other generations that they've grown up with or had around over the years. So again, it's a perfect. There's different ways, obviously, that nostalgia sort of utilizes itself within animation. Primarily, this is distinct in Toy Story, where it wasn't necessarily a transfer of one particular group of kids, whereas it was just carrying those kids on over to see the sort of final movie, although that's still up in the air, I guess, because I guess they do want to continue on making a fourth one, which I don't really see why they need to do that, but they want to do it. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say about the impact of nostalgia, because if you can get some cartoon to be well recognized, it makes it a lot easier to transfer it over to another generation of children. Um, and I think it's worked fairly well for Disney. It's worked well for other different animations that have come and gone over the years. Um, for example, I think even recently they created sort of a new Looney Tunes thing. So they're really trying to bring back all of these older cartoons and make them sort of a part of the younger generations. And I think that ultimately can work. I don't think, you need to constantly be creating something new and original for animation. I think you can do a lot of transfer and a lot of, and I think a lot of creativity can really shine through from that. It's not necessarily taking something and copying it. It's taking something that was fairly relevant and popular during the time and introducing it into a new format. And in doing so, creating something that's resemblance to what was initially created, but also something completely new and unique. Um, I think that's really the most important thing to get by, at least when it comes to this concept, because it is very prevalent. And um, Disney definitely was, I think, the first to really hone in on this market and really use it to its advantage. Obviously, there's been other animation studios that have tried to do this as well, but since Disney has been around for so long, it only makes sense that they would be able to do that. But obviously, there's others. For example, the Peanuts that is being made into a movie that's supposedly, I think, out right now. So again, there is a lot of this desire to reinvigorate older cartoons and bring something completely new to the table with them. And I think there is a lot that can be done to do that. And I think it's good to have the kind of balance, you know. It's good to have things that are sort of reemerging and being a part of other kids' lives. And then I think it's also good that, you know, there's other newer animations that are being created, that is something that can be maybe even nostalgic to the current generation of children. So again, it's sort of a toss of the hat, so to speak, as to whether or not you want to bring something completely new to the table, or if you want to reinvigorate something and bring that to the forefront and do it in a completely unique and interesting way, while still staying true to the heart of the original material, I guess you could say, or the original creation of the animation. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say about this topic. I mean, it's really interesting. But I think, if you've looked at animation, if you've seen a lot of what animation has done, in particular, I think Western animation, um, it's almost like a lot of it is trying to be reinvigorated and transferred. I think less so with, in particular, Japanese animation, because I think Japanese animation has a different way of marketing their animation, because it's a little bit more broader as to who is exactly the demographics. Um, Unlike Western animation, that I think is more tied into being more childlike, even though, again, there's obviously Western shows that are primarily, again, utilized to just be comedic, and also be cartoons. But again, I think there is this nostalgia that keeps cropping up from a lot of this Western style animation that you can find, but not so much with, I think, Japanese, because that's like a different category altogether. But again, I think that's really ultimately all I can say for this video. If there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.